Welcome to NuclearCast, the official podcast of the Analyst Deterrence Center. Our host is Dr. Adam Lowther, co-founder and vice president for research at the National Institute for Deterrence Studies. The Analyst Deterrence Center is a 501c3 organization ensuring a broader understanding of the nation's strategic nuclear deterrent and its ongoing modernization. Thank you for listening and welcome to the show. The views of the host and the guests are their own.
Welcome back to another episode of NuclearCast. Of course, as always, as on all but one episode, I think, I am your host, Adam Lowther, and today we have research fellow at the Heritage Foundation, Bob Peters. And we're going to talk about, so welcome back.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks for having me again. It's great to be here.
And we're going to talk about the Strategic Posture Commission's recently released report. Unfortunately, that report, which was, the Strategic Posture Commission was bipartisan. It was half Republicans, half Democrats, and it had folks with a long background in nuclear issues from both parties. And of course, the report turned out in ways that many in the arms control community did not expect. They did not expect some of their fellow Democrats to sign off on a report that ultimately called for, new nukes, differentiate or greater, addition of new types of nuclear weapons. It was a bit stunning in how the report came out. And there's been a Twitter storm, or a social media forum formerly known as Twitter storm. And Bob has been following this and paying close attention to it. And in many respects, he has been as surprised by the reaction, or for the media, the complete lack of coverage of this. And so we thought we would talk about that today. So with that, Bob, why don't you give our listeners your sort of initial thoughts on this, on the report itself, and then on the media coverage and the disarmament community's reaction to the report.
Yeah, thanks, Adam, and thanks again for having me on. I think the report, it came out earlier this month in October. We're recording here on the 30th. I think it's really important. I mean, as you pointed out, it's bipartisan, 6 men, 6 women, and it was a good mix. I mean, you had think tankers on there. You had arms control ambassadors on there. Rose Gottmiller was on there. General Hyten, former vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs. You had professors from Georgetown, think tanks, Department of Energy, Department of Defense experts. It was really about as good a commission as you could pull together. And they achieved consensus on the document. And, in a nutshell, the document says, we have to have far greater conventional capabilities in order to deter our adversaries. The term they used was there's a deterrence gap when it comes to the United States and Russia, and the United States and China. And they said we have to have more long-range strike munitions, more fifth-generation aircraft, a larger Navy surface fleet and subsurface fleet. And if you don't build all those things, you're going to be forced to rely upon nuclear weapons to enable a secure and stable deterrent relationship. And then they start talking about what are some of those, revitalized nuclear capabilities you're going to need. And they talk about, Road Mobile Sentinel, which is the Road Mobile ICBMs. Right now, they're supposed to be silo-based, and the commission put out an idea with which I heartily agree, is that we need to look seriously at fielding Road Mobile Sentinel. They talked about theater range nuclear capabilities that could be fired off of a sea platform. So they're pretty much referring to SLCM, and they were talking about the need to revitalize the infrastructure that goes into producing new warheads. And they kept the door open for a larger arsenal. And, I agree with almost everything they wrote. I think it's astonishing that they were able to get consensus between some of the very different viewpoints there, for those who I term as like the nuclear realists, who are very sympathetic to our need to have a strong and robust nuclear arsenal, and those who are more inclined for a more reductionist perspective on trying to shrink the size of the arsenal. And they came together and said, given the threats, given the breathtaking expansion of the Chinese arsenal and what the Russians are doing and the general state of the world we're in, we need to reinvest in the nuclear arsenal for the next several decades. I think what it comes down to is I think this is kind of the rebirth of the American arsenal. When you look out over the next half century, it's astonishing.
Yeah, it was, I had to chuckle whenever I saw the report and just what it said, because I knew, some of the, Rose Gottmiller and Leonore Tamaro have been staunch sort of reductionists over the course of their careers. And then, you've got James Acton and John Wolfstall and Hans Christensen and the disarmament organizations that have just got to be apoplectic in terms of, this and just the, it's sort of one of those, it's a period in which the idealists have been, mugged by reality. And how have they, in terms of what you see in it, because you're in the Beltway and you deal with these folks regularly, as opposed for those of us who are out, in flyover country, what's been the reaction to this report? Because I'm not reading about it in the Washington Post or the New York Times, or I'm not reading about it anywhere.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. The media reaction has been incredibly muted. I mean, I think the Wall Street Journal did a single article on it. The Washington Post, the New York Times didn't, even though they were invited, as my understanding is, they didn't send a single reporter to the rollout. The two media organizations that were at the actual physical rollout was the Wall Street Journal and Arms Control Association. Those are the two media outlets that are there. So there's been some little pieces that have come out in like Real Clear Defense and Defense News, but there hasn't been a big, splashy, media piece on the front page of the Washington Post or the New York Times, or their Sunday pieces, which is a bit mystifying. To your first question, I think the reactions from our friends in the disarmament community, like as you pointed out, Daryl Kimball and Matt Korda and James Actons, it's been one of, disappointment, in which, I think that they're disappointed with some of the folks who they saw as their natural allies, like Ambassador Gottmiller, as you pointed out, and Leonore Tamara and so forth. I think there's some disappointment there that they see them as embracing a robust role for nuclear weapons as a cornerstone of America's deterrent. And I think that in some ways, they still look at the world as though it's 2009, 2010, in which the United States can lead the way for a reduced role for nuclear weapons on the world stage as part of a long but steady march to global nuclear disarmament. And, in 2009, I had some sympathy for that position, but 2009, frankly, was a long, long time ago. And the world's security environment has degraded significantly since then. And so I think a lot of times when you're in our business, you need to be very careful with yourself when new information comes to the forefront. Does it change your internal analysis? Does it change your decision calculus? Does it change? Do new facts change what you believe should the outcomes be? And so if Russia invades Ukraine in 2014 and then the mid 2010s starts threatening to nuke countries like Denmark and Poland, and China under Xi Jinping is on the march and threatening to invade their neighbors, and Iran, according to the Defense Department, could have enough fissile material for a nuclear weapon within 2 weeks. and the world security environment degrades over the past 10 years, do you change your analysis and say, okay, well, you know what? I think it is time to build the nuclear arsenal for the 21st century. Or do you say, no, we just need to try harder at confidence building measures and arms control treaties and strategic dialogues and unilateral nuclear reductions? If you don't change your analysis, I have to question whether or not you're still an objective analyst or if you're simply an activist, right? And the difference is an activist, it doesn't matter what kind of external factors there are. The end point is still the same. They're just an activist who's trying to get to an end goal. An analyst looks at what is the new information coming in, what are the developments, and then how does that impact my analysis, and do I need to change? And so I think a lot of our friends in the nuclear disarmament community, to be honest with you, I think they find themselves outside the mainstream at this point.
Yeah, I've long thought it wasn't simply activism, that it was, it was a sort of a cult-like belief in, when you give inanimate objects, moral logic and moral reasoning, that's one of the things you don't sort of take that ability away from people and give it to, in this case, a weapon, then you've sort of lost the ball in terms of being an analyst. And then you're, in many respects, like you said, it's a fervent religious belief. And that's where I think it's been so detrimental to U.S. security. But one of the things that I've struggled with and tried to, and I've written about it is, and I think the Strategic Posture Commission kind of fell into this as well, this mistake, and that is that if we were to build more conventional capability that's actually really good, the problem with that is that our adversaries can't match it. And so therefore they rely more heavily on nuclear weapons. And so this is a spiral effect. And so advocating, well, we need these conventional or we're going to have to rely on nukes. It doesn't really work that way because you're not taking into account what how your adversary is going to respond.
Yeah, so I think you're exactly right, and I'll double down on that. So you oftentimes you hear this from our friends in the disarmament community, is like, well, we just we have enough conventional munitions and they're so super precise that we can achieve all of the effects we want to with these conventional capabilities. If they actually believe that's where they wanted to go from a deterrence perspective, they would be arguing for about a $1 trillion defense budget. And they'd be arguing for the 600 ship Navy, and they'd be arguing for, 2,000 long range anti ship missiles and 20,000 Tomahawk cruise missiles and intercontinental range prompt conventional strike and a huge buy of fifth generation aircraft. And I don't know, 500 B-21s, whatever that number is for the B-21 force. It would be enormous. And they would be screaming about, in a way that would make Bridge Colby blush for the amount of conventional capabilities that they would want. That's what they would be screaming for. But they never do, which makes you wonder, do they really believe in this, or is this simply a tactical argument that they make to get them the end goal of nuclear reduction? But your other point is spot on, is that the Russians have said for 20 years now that because they can't match us in precision-guided conventional strike regime, they have to go to these non-strategic weapons. Whether you believe them or not, that's their argument. So if you actually did double down on the long-range conventional precision strike regime, and you took the Russians seriously, that's why they've built these things, well, then why wouldn't the Russians go from 2,000 non-strategic nuclear weapons to 4,000, or whatever that number would be?
This episode of NucleCast is brought to you by the ANWA Deterrence Center, whose mission is to educate Americans about the nuclear enterprise and strategic deterrence.
No, I agree with you. And that's one of the things that I never really hear anybody talking about is how do you deal with that problem? because we know we have a gap in non-strategics, in, short, medium, and intermediate range, lower yield, non-strategic. We have a huge gap there. And the Russians, that's where the majority of their capability fits, is in that area. And I wonder why we haven't learned, because if you really go back and look, I think INF and what happened with INF and the Reagan administration's reasoning there to build the capability to then bargain it away. And I generally don't like this idea that, war is all about bargaining. But in this case, there was a bargain made. And I wonder why we're not sort of looking back at past successful examples. It's actually one example where arms control worked in our favor. It's one of the few examples. And I wonder why we're not actually talking about that and saying, well, how, is there a lesson to be learned here? And is there a way to essentially create, everybody wants to talk about stable deterrence. I'm not exactly sure how that's defined, but they want to talk about stability. But by creating gaps, I think you create instability. And then trying to plug it with conventional munitions that are easily, certainly imminently usable, I'm not sure that creates the stability that you're looking for.
Right. So, in like strategic stability, it can be hard to define. I personally define it as you have a strategic relationship that's stable if neither side has an incentive to strike first, particularly with a nuclear weapon. Right. That those incentives have been removed, and in point of fact, there's disincentives there for either side to strike first. Right. Which is why we have assured second strike capabilities in our SSBN force. Various countries make different investment decisions in part to pursue strategic stability. And that's part of why there are certain confidence building measures, such as data exchanges and the various hotlines and all that stuff, right? And all that's good. But if you have a situation in which the Chinese have theater nuclear dominance because they've built dual capable theater range missiles that can carry conventional or a nuclear warhead, that can track both fixed targets like our bases on Guam or Japan or Australia, and nuclear theater range missiles that can strike an American ship that's under steam doing 30 knots in the West Pac or the Philippine Sea. And we've got nothing. We have no theater nuclear weapons in the Western Pacific to speak of at all, period. That's destabilizing. Because if I'm China and I say, well, I've got all these theater systems and the only thing the Americans can strike back with is either a gravity bomb that they have to fly from North America and then fly over my country through my integrated air defense systems, drop the bomb, have the bomber turn around and fly back, or they're looking at an SSBN, a ballistic missile submarine, firing a low yield weapon. And then you look at the asymmetry of the target, I would say that's highly destabilizing. I personally, I think that is the area in the world in which we have the greatest amount of strategic instability, and it's to our detriment and to China's favor, is in the Western Pacific. And that's a result of our lack of investment decisions. And I would offer a very conscious decision on the part of the Chinese to invest in theater range nuclear systems. And to me, it's really stabilizing.
It does seem that the Russians and the Chinese follow American politics. They understand where we sit in terms of the political debates in this country. And it's pretty clear that they know what we're not doing. And then they flow into that area. And it sort of holds us back. It's a restraint on us. I wonder, do you think the Strategic Posture Commission report will ultimately give, and the administration has long, Senator Biden was long an advocate of arms reductions. So it's not that he's changed his policy from when he was in the Senate or, when he was the vice president. But do you think this will give the president, and he may, if he wins a second term, or maybe it's a new, we don't really know what's going to happen in the 2024 election, give them cover to do something dramatically different. Because when you have constituencies, and one of President Biden's constituencies is the arms control community. And so I wonder, when you have that constituency and you've made promises, can you sort of break those promises because the strategic environment has changed? Or is it more akin to, George H.W. Bush's, no new taxes, and then he raises taxes and then loses the election?
Yeah, I think as you're correct to point out is that President Biden for 40 years has not been a fan of nuclear weapons, and that's fine. That's his opinion, but I think the impetus for change is going to come from Congress, and I think what you're seeing is a bipartisan understanding that the arsenal is not in a good place, and that we need more capabilities to deter the authoritarians who are on the march. And that's why I think both in the 2023 and now in the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act and the Defense Appropriations Act, that both the Democrats and Republicans in Congress are saying, no, we need SLICM-N, which is the sea-launched nuclear-capable cruise missile, which is really ideally situated as a deterrent weapon for the Western Pacific against China. They're saying, no, you can't retire the B-83, which is our large, big crowd pleaser, bomb that the Biden administration tried to retire, unless you've got something to replace it. And Congress told that to the administration. And I think what you're going to see in Congress is a desire for a more diverse nuclear arsenal that's got more variety and capabilities, and that is larger. And I think that's going to be the driver throughout the course of the Biden administration, whether or not the president wins re-election in 24 or not. And then we'll just have to see, if President Biden loses re-election, whoever the Republican nominee is, whether or not he or she will take this up as an issue. I personally think that the Strategic Posture Commission represents the new mainstream in nuclear thought and deterrence thought within America. And those who are on the disarmament side, they're no longer part of the mainstream. They are outside the mainstream. They're frankly extremists at this point. And I think that you just need to look at Congress for that. I think you look at Brad Roberts' report on China's emergence as a second nuclear peer that came out in spring of 23 as an example of that new mainstream. Strategic Posture Commission is an example of that new mainstream. And so we'll simply see if the disarmament community continues to marginalize itself and isolate itself. And frankly, whether or not it's still going to have any impact on the policy debate. And I think that they're at a point now that they're making themselves irrelevant to the policy debate.
Yeah, it's hard once you've built such a sort of a staunch position that, to come off of it. And it's, whenever I talk to folks about, having been a member of the nuclear maximalists for a long time, I often say, well, listen, I don't really care about nuclear weapons per se. I care about how do I achieve the effect. Right now, I have to rely on nuclear weapons. But if I could do it with rods from God or lasers or, you pick, I don't really care. I'm just trying to achieve an effect. And nuclear weapons happen to be the tool that I can achieve that effect. Whereas when you moralize something, and this is, so for me, it's not an issue of morality. It's neither good nor evil. It's just a tool. But when you moralize it, the challenge for that is that you can't all of a sudden say, well, we've now decided that they are in fact moral. That's just something you can't do.
I think that's exactly right. I think that's exactly right, because you paint yourself into a corner in which you have no other choice other than to oppose them, come what may. And I think you're exactly right. I mean, for me, I want to deter nuclear war. And for me, in the environment in which we live, because man is flawed, and we can only influence the decisions of the dictators in Moscow and Beijing only so far. The best way to prevent nuclear war is to have a credible and robust nuclear deterrent. And my concern is that the folks who moralize nuclear weapons and see them as inherently evil, as you pointed out, inherently evil, are making it more likely that we'll see a nuclear war because of their policies. And I think that's why they've made themselves increasingly irrelevant to the policy debate.
So it's that time in the show where I like to bring out Bob. And so Bob is my magic genie. And if I rub my lamp and you're granted 3 wishes so we've talked about the Nuclear Posture Commission report. So in relation to that, Bob grants wishes. Now, world peace isn't one of them. It's only related to the Nuclear Posture Commission report. So if you had 3 wishes about that, what would wish number 1 be?
Okay. It would be that both nominees for the 2024 election, Republican and Democrat, read the report themselves, and they don't have, an aide read it for them and they summarize it for the boss. My wish 1 would be that they read the report, take it to heart, and then they made an address to the American people and to Congress, and they said, we tried hard to get to a world without nuclear weapons under President Obama. Unfortunately, people didn't follow that direction, and we live in a world in which the authoritarians are on the march and they're invested in nuclear weapons. I hate that we're here, but we are here, and therefore we need a credible nuclear arsenal for the 21st century to ensure that deterrence is stable and successful for the next half century. That would be thing 1. Thing 2, and that follows from thing 1, would be the president calls in the Secretary of Energy and the NNSA administrator, who's the person in charge of the agency that builds the warheads and produces the plutonium and all that. He calls those 2 people into his or her office. And the president says to the Secretary of Energy, you've got the grid, you've got the power grid, you've got renewable energy, nuclear, you've got all that stuff. You leave nukes to me. And then he turned to the NNSA administrator and said, you're going to be in my office once a week, give me a report on this, because we are falling behind in our ability to produce plutonium pits, to produce the other exotic isotopes that go into warheads. And by God, we're going to be cranking out warheads no later than 2030, because we need to catch up, because we need to not only do the 1-to-1 replacement for the current arsenal that's rotting in place, but we're going to build a larger and more diverse arsenal that will ensure American freedom and prosperity for the next half century. And you're going to get on it and you're going to fix this. That's thing 2. Thing 3, wish 3, is then the president goes to Congress and sits down with Republicans and Democrats in the Senate and the House and says, look, this is not going to be cheap. We need to spend money, and we need a larger arsenal and more diverse capabilities. And I'm not an expert. I wasn't elected to make the arsenal great again. I was elected to do other things, right? But I do understand that this is really, really important. And so we need to force the Pentagon to do the analysis that's necessary for what is the size and composition of the strategic arsenal. And maybe it's road mobile ICBMs, maybe it's road mobile Sentinel, maybe it's more bombers, and we need more capabilities at the theater level. And, maybe those capabilities are a sea-launched nuclear-capable cruise missile. Maybe we need an anti-ship nuclear-capable missile. Maybe we need hypersonic missiles with a nuclear weapon on there. In addition to all these other things that we need, which is a larger Navy and more F-35s and more long-range precision strike munitions and all that stuff. And so we need the money. It's expensive, but this is a priority, and this is what we need in order to secure American freedom and prosperity. And then we begin the 2030s, in which we're cranking out warheads and we're building more theater range capabilities, and we've got a new arsenal. So that by 2040, we're in a really good place. And that place is not an arsenal that's as big as Russia plus China combined, but it's enough to ensure American security and deter nuclear war, which is, kind of the goal of this whole operation.
So you mentioned not as big as Russia and China combined. Why do you say that? Because there's rationale for, hey, you've got three adversaries. So it's not Russia and China. It's Russia, China, North Korea, and potentially Iran. And then you've got, the United States and the UK on the other side.
Yeah.
And if, Matt Kroenig was one of the commissioners, and he's written a book about this, and his whole premise is the country in a crisis, the country with the larger arsenal is the one who achieves their objectives when it's two nuclear armed, nations in the crisis.
Right.
And so why would we want to put ourselves in a position where we might not have parity?
So look, it's a great question. It's a really good question. So part of it is, I don't know how quickly we can catch up to the Russians plus the Chinese. I just don't know if that's technically feasible in the next 10, 15 years. I don't know if it's politically feasible in Congress, like both for the amount of money it would take to build that. So I don't know how feasible it is. But then the third point is I don't know if that's necessary. And so you go back to Galois, the French nuclear theorist in the 1950s and 60s, who said you don't actually need, and look, I think Matt's a great guy. I think he's brilliant. But Galois would say you don't need an arsenal as big as the other guy. You just need to convince the other guy that you don't, that he can't achieve his desired goals without incurring so much cost as to make it unworkable. And so that's not to say that I embrace minimal deterrence. I certainly do not. But I don't think to have a credible deterrence, it has to be the Russian arsenal plus the Chinese arsenal plus 10 more weapons. I don't think that's necessary. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah. It's a good point of debate. And the challenge is we don't have, sufficient hard data to prove either way. That's the biggest challenge, is we just can't say with much certainty, because for good reason, we don't fight nuclear wars, that's a great thing. Deterrence has held for 70 plus years, which is exactly what we want. But I don't ever want it to fail. I think you and I would agree. We never want to be in a position where it might fail. So last word before we end the show. What would be your takeaway for the listeners about the Nuclear Posture Commission's report?
I think that it is I think it's a report that is going to be looked back upon as being like the dawn of a new nuclear age, in which fervent believers in nuclear reduction have said, we need to reinvest in the arsenal and have a credible deterrence, and they made common cause with folks who may be inclined to begin with to have a robust and credible deterrence. And that's simply a reflection of how dire the situation is. And I think that this is going to be the beginning of the next stage of the American deterrence. I think it's a really important document, and I encourage everyone to go out and read it. It's very accessible. You don't need a master's degree or a PhD to read it or understand it. It's written so that anyone, with a high school education can read it and understand it. To its credit.
Right. Bob Peters, Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you. It was a lot of fun.
And thanks to you, the listeners, for joining us on this episode of NucleCast, and we'll see you on the next episode. Well, great talk with Bob Peters, as always. It's funny. I always enjoy what Bob has to say and most often agree with him. So it was good to hear from Bob and to talk about the Strategic Posture Commission report. And I don't know if you've read it, or at least read, sort of the executive summary, but it is somewhat surprising what given the composition of its members, how sort of pro-nuke it was. And then to hear the arms control community on Twitter, and it's just the reaction's certainly been interesting. And I think it's for many of these folks that sort of made these supportive decisions towards the arsenal, I think it should be indicative. It should be sort of like a flashing bulb of just how difficult of a situation the United States is in. And it's really, it was good to have Bob on to sort of talk through this with, and what are the implications of it. So I don't know about you, but I enjoyed it.
This has been a production of the ANWA Deterrence Center, a 501c3 that seeks to educate key decision makers, stakeholders, and the public to ensure a broader understanding of the nation's strategic nuclear deterrent. Our executive producer is Kimberly Charrington, and this episode has been engineered and mixed by David Krumthal. Help us grow our followers by sharing it, and follow the show on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at NucleCast.